In the sprawling expanse of the Pacific during World War II, the Imperial Japanese Navy considered itself unrivaled in speed, discipline, and naval precision. Its destroyers, especially the renowned Fubuki and Kajiro classes, were among the fastest and most heavily armed warships in the world. These vessels embodied the Japanese naval philosophy, domination through technological excellence and sheer willpower. Yet as the war unfolded and the tide turned against Japan, their destroyer captains would find themselves blindsided by something they had never anticipated: small, wooden American PT boats, racing through the dark at 40 knots, striking like lightning and vanishing before a counterattack could even begin. It was a humiliation that the Japanese command neither predicted nor understood, and it came not from superior firepower, but from audacity, innovation, and speed. The idea that something so small and so fragile could pose a threat to a destroyer seemed absurd to Japanese naval strategists. Their destroyers were ocean predators, massive engines of war designed to escort battleships, hunt submarines, and deliver devastating torpedo attacks using the legendary Type 93 Long Lance. These torpedoes, powered by pure oxygen, were the pride of Japan's engineers and the terror of the Allied fleets. They could travel over 20 kilometers and hit with enough force to shatter even a cruiser. A Japanese destroyer was built to be feared, its crew trained for years in the art of precision gunnery and torpedo warfare. In contrast, the American PT boats, barely 80 feet long, made of plywood and mahogany, seemed like toys. They carried only a few torpedoes, some heavy machine guns, and a handful of brave sailors. To the Japanese, they were irrelevant in the grand scale of naval warfare, suitable only for patrol duty or coastal scouting. That arrogance would soon cost them dearly. By 1943, the Pacific was no longer a Japanese lake. The U.S. Navy, having suffered early defeats, was adapting rapidly. Instead of meeting Japan ship for ship, the Americans began to exploit technology, radar, and mobility. Their PT boats, patrol torpedo boats, were small but incredibly fast, driven by 3 Packard engines that could push them past 40 knots. They could glide across shallow waters, where destroyers dared not go, and strike from darkness with torpedoes that carried just enough punch to cripple or even sink much larger ships. In regions like the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Philippines, where the sea was dotted with islands and reefs, these agile boats became a nightmare for larger vessels. The Japanese destroyers, optimized for open-water combat, suddenly found themselves in a deadly cat-and-mouse game in narrow straits where speed, not size, ruled. The irony of the situation was striking. The same Japanese destroyers that once terrified Allied sailors were now being stalked by the smallest warcraft the U.S. Navy possessed. This inversion of roles created confusion at every level of the Imperial Navy. Captains filed frustrated reports to their superiors, describing how they fired hundreds of shells at American ghosts and saw nothing but waves. Commanders in Rabaul and Truk at first refused to believe these accounts. Only when losses mounted did they begin to take the threat seriously. By then, it was too late. American PT squadrons were multiplying, using guerrilla-style tactics to harass convoys, intercept destroyers, and block nighttime supply routes. The Japanese called them devil boats, acknowledging, grudgingly, their effectiveness. What made these encounters particularly shocking for Japanese crews was the sheer boldness of the PT boat operators. These were not cautious sailors, they were daredevils. Many were barely in their 20s, commanding boats in total darkness, often within visual range of enemy ships bristling with guns. They depended on speed and nerve to survive. They had to calculate attack angles manually, launch torpedoes without stabilizers, and rely on instinct more than instruments. When President John F. Kennedy commanded PT 109 in the Solomon Islands, he was part of this same daring fraternity. The PT crews took pride in confronting giants. To them, every destroyer sunk or damaged was proof that courage and ingenuity could overcome firepower. Meanwhile, the Japanese destroyer captains faced a crisis of confidence. Their ships, designed for long-range engagements, were now reduced to firing blindly into darkness. The noise of their own engines masked the faint hum of approaching PT boats. Their lookouts strained their eyes, peering into the black Pacific night, seeing only waves and shadows. And then, suddenly, the dreaded splash of incoming torpedoes. Sometimes they evaded, sometimes they didn't. The panic of hearing "torpedo to starboard," and feeling the ship shudder was enough to shake even veteran officers. The PT boats had turned the night ocean into a hunter's ground where the hunters became the hunted. As the war dragged into 1944 and 1945, Japanese destroyers found themselves increasingly vulnerable. Fuel shortages, lack of radar, and deteriorating crew training all played a role. The PT boats, on the other hand, kept improving. They gained better torpedoes, better radios, and even rockets. In some areas, they operated in coordination with aircraft, using flares and spotlights to trap Japanese ships. The 40-knot strike became a symbol of American improvisation, a blend of mechanical power and human daring that the Japanese naval system could not match. Their destroyers, built for glory, were being harassed to exhaustion by boats that cost less than a single destroyer's turret. When historians later examined why Japanese destroyers were caught so off guard, the conclusion was simple: doctrine and pride. The Imperial Navy, steeped in traditional notions of honor and decisive battle, had not trained for unconventional threats. They could not imagine that the enemy would embrace chaos and small-scale warfare as a tool of victory. The Americans, pragmatic and inventive, saw opportunity in speed and surprise. In that difference lay the story of the PT boat's success. The Japanese destroyers' downfall was not due to inferior craftsmanship, they were superb ships, but due to a failure of imagination. Even after the war, surviving Japanese officers reflected on their encounters with PT boats with a mix of disbelief and respect. Some admitted they had laughed when they first heard of the small craft. They were made of wood, one former destroyer officer recalled, and yet they hunted us like sharks. The humiliation of being chased by such tiny vessels was something few could forget. But there was also admiration, for the audacity, for the will to fight, and for the technology that enabled such boldness. In the end, the clash between the Japanese destroyers and American PT boats was more than a battle of weapons, it was a battle of philosophies. The Japanese believed in perfection, the Americans believed in possibility. And in the unpredictable chaos of war, possibility often wins. The Pacific War raged into its second, then third brutal year. The Imperial Japanese Navy continued to regard its destroyers as the kings of the night seas, fast, elegant predators armed with the deadly Type 93 long lance torpedoes that could outrun almost anything afloat. These vessels, sleek and superbly engineered, had been built for decisive engagements, for the grand surface battles that Japanese admirals envisioned since the days of Tsushima. Yet when they encountered the mosquito-like American PT boats, their sense of superiority began to crack. To the Japanese crews, the idea that these small wooden craft could approach undetected and strike at over 40 knots was inconceivable. They had spent years training to fight cruisers, carriers, and other destroyers, not cigar-shaped speed demons that darted across black water with engines roaring like angry hornets. For the men aboard the Japanese destroyers, it wasn't just a new enemy, it was an insult to naval tradition, a kind of warfare that broke all the rules they had learned at the academy. The first serious encounters came in the Solomon Islands, where American PT squadrons operated from hidden jungle bases, darting out under cover of darkness. The Japanese destroyer captains, accustomed to the precision of fleet maneuvers and the discipline of set battle plans, suddenly found themselves under attack from multiple directions by craft barely visible even under searchlights. Radar was still primitive, and the PT boats' small size and wooden hulls made them nearly invisible on screens. Japanese lookouts often reported phantom shapes, a wake, a flicker of flame, a fleeting shadow, before a torpedo hissed toward them at terrifying speed. The destroyers' big guns could not depress low enough or turn fast enough to hit the elusive attackers. Tracers stitched the sea, but the PTs were already gone, vanishing into darkness at 40 knots, leaving confusion and disbelief in their wake. For officers trained to respect order and hierarchy, the chaos of these encounters was deeply unsettling. They began to realize that their destroyers, designed for grand engagements, were vulnerable in the wild, unpredictable knife fights that PT boats thrived in. The Americans, meanwhile, understood the psychological edge they held. PT crews, often young and brash, reveled in their underdog role. They called their vessels plywood wonders or rum runners with torpedoes, but they knew how to exploit every advantage. Their Packard engines screamed like demons, producing wakes so violent they confused radar and hid the boat's true movements. The Japanese, still relying heavily on visual spotting, often mistook multiple PTs for one, or one for many. Every encounter turned into a guessing game that sapped morale and confidence. Reports began to circulate among Japanese fleets that these small boats could appear out of nowhere, almost supernatural, like ghosts on the sea. Sailors told stories of torpedoes streaking from empty waves, of explosions that seemed to come from beneath. The more they spoke of it, the more their fear grew, until even hardened destroyer veterans began to question their own eyes. American intelligence picked up intercepted chatter revealing that Japanese commanders were ordering stricter watch rotations and doubling their gunnery crews at night, all to counter an enemy that weighed less than 1/10 of their displacement. For American naval strategists, this reaction was exactly what they wanted. PT boats were never meant to sink the Japanese fleet outright, their job was to harass, confuse, and slow the enemy down. But in doing so, they achieved something more. They shattered the myth of invulnerability surrounding Japanese destroyers. Each successful strike, each night of chaos, chipped away at Japanese confidence and forced them to change tactics. The destroyers began to zigzag constantly, wasting precious fuel. Their commanders started refusing to travel through certain waters after dark, fearful of PT ambushes. This paralysis, small at first, grew into a pattern that hindered Japan's ability to supply its island garrisons. The PT boats, with their speed and audacity, had turned the Empire's most powerful destroyers into nervous giants, lumbering through the Pacific as prey rather than predators. What made it worse for Japan was pride, an unwillingness to admit that small, improvised American boats could dominate them. Official reports downplayed the damage, but word spread among crews, and morale quietly deteriorated. The clash between these two types of naval warriors, the disciplined, formal Japanese destroyer crews and the reckless, improvising American PT sailors, revealed a deeper truth about the Pacific War. It was a battle not just of machines, but of mindsets. The Japanese had built their fleet around doctrines of honor, range, and decisive confrontation. The Americans, adapting quickly, valued innovation, risk, and flexibility. When a PT boat commander realized he could hit 40 knots, he saw opportunity, a chance to rewrite the rules. But when a Japanese captain saw a wooden craft charging him at that speed, he saw an impossibility. That difference in perception often determined who lived and who died. Over time, the Japanese learned to use their searchlights more sparingly, to coordinate with shore batteries, and to deploy smaller escort craft. Yet the psychological damage had been done. Every time a wave crashed in the dark or an engine roared in the distance, the destroyer crews tensed, fingers on triggers, haunted by the memory of those swift American attackers. By late 1944, as the tide of war turned irrevocably against Japan, the PT boats' legend had grown. Even when their engines sputtered or their weapons malfunctioned, their reputation alone was enough to cause confusion. Japanese convoys scattered at the first hint of PT activity. Pilots in the air were warned to avoid friendly destroyers engaging unidentified fast craft. Too many friendly fire incidents had occurred in the confusion. The Japanese Navy's once unshakable night-fighting confidence, honed over decades, was gone. In its place was hesitation, a kind of weariness born of endless skirmishes against an enemy that refused to fight properly. The Americans, meanwhile, kept refining their tactics, learning to use radar fixes, flare support from aircraft, and coordinated ambushes. In doing so, they made the PT boats not just a nuisance but a strategic tool that extended Allied control over the seas. Each engagement told the same story: the destroyers' shells thundered into empty water while the PTs vanished at 40 knots, their laughter and engine roars fading into the night like a taunt. When the war finally neared its end, Japanese reports still referred to the PT menace with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. One captured officer admitted that, the speed and daring of the enemy's small craft defied prediction, a quiet acknowledgement of how deeply those encounters had shaken them. For every destroyer captain who scoffed at the idea of being challenged by a boat made of plywood, there was another who had watched comrades perish in sudden explosions at midnight. The Americans, with their relentless aggression and mechanical ingenuity, had proven that courage and creativity could overturn even the most rigid doctrines. The Japanese destroyers, once the terror of the Pacific, became symbols of an old order overtaken by new realities, a fleet outthought and outmaneuvered by men who dared to believe speed and surprise could triumph over armor and pride. The roar of those PT engines still echoed in the memories of survivors long after the guns fell silent, a haunting reminder of how swiftly the balance of power at sea could change when one side underestimated the other. By the midpoint of the Pacific War, the contrast between Japanese destroyers and American PT boats had evolved into one of the most fascinating tactical clashes ever recorded at sea. The destroyers, elegant instruments of imperial ambition, had been designed for long-range missions and decisive combat under the guiding hand of meticulous admirals. Each ship was a floating embodiment of Japan's naval doctrine, sleek hulls, powerful guns, and the famed long-lance torpedoes that could strike unseen across miles of ocean. In theory, no small enemy craft could threaten such vessels. Yet, as the night battles of the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Philippines unfolded, this doctrine collided head-on with an unexpected adversary, swarms of American PT boats, darting across the surface like vengeful spirits of the sea. To the Japanese sailors, these encounters were surreal. The destroyers' searchlights swept across the black waves, cutting ribbons of light into darkness, only to reveal fleeting silhouettes that vanished before a gun could even be aimed. A new kind of war had arrived, one where speed, daring, and improvisation mattered more than armor and formality. The Japanese destroyer crews were brave and well-trained, but they were prisoners of their own expectations. Their commanders had been schooled in battleship logic, the idea that larger ships dictated the course of war. They were told that courage and precision would always triumph, that the destroyer's speed and firepower made it the undisputed predator of the ocean. When the first PT boats appeared, the Japanese didn't even consider them worthy opponents. Some captains ordered their gunners not to waste ammunition on small American pests. But this arrogance soon gave way to confusion, then fear. The PT boats attacked like wolves in the dark, small, fast, and unpredictable. Their torpedoes, though smaller than the long lance, were lethal at close range. Many Japanese destroyers found themselves suddenly hit, their hulls cracked by explosions from enemies they couldn't even see. What haunted the crews most wasn't just the damage, it was the invisibility of their attackers. The ocean, once their ally, had turned into a hiding place for ghosts. The old certainties of naval warfare, range, visibility, and command, were disintegrating under the roar of American engines. American PT crews thrived on this chaos. They had no illusions about being indestructible, most knew their boats could be shredded by a single shell. But that vulnerability only heightened their boldness. Their missions demanded nerves of steel, racing through enemy fire, launching torpedoes at lightning speed, then vanishing into the night. Many PT captains became legends not because of superior equipment, but because of raw instinct and courage. They learned to use the sea's darkness as armor, to read the rhythm of Japanese searchlights, and to strike in moments of maximum confusion. When they hit 40 knots, it wasn't just speed, it was survival. Japanese destroyers tried to counter with flares and tracers, but these only revealed their own positions. The PT boats' maneuverability turned every battle into a deadly dance, with massive destroyers spinning desperately to track targets that were already gone. American propaganda later romanticized these engagements, but the truth was even more dramatic. They were wars within wars, fought in the narrow channels and shadowed bays of the Pacific, where a few brave men in wooden boats could change the fate of convoys worth millions of tons of supplies. As these encounters grew, so too did the psychological gulf between the two sides. Japanese officers began reporting sightings of PT boats in areas where none were present, firing on waves and shadows, convinced that the Americans had developed invisible craft. They installed extra lookouts, manned guns through the night, and reduced speed to listen for engine sounds, all of which made them slower, easier targets for Allied submarines and aircraft. The PTs, meanwhile, were learning from every engagement. Radar upgrades, improved torpedo reliability, and coordination with aircraft made them even deadlier. The Americans realized that by forcing Japanese destroyers to waste ammunition, fuel, and sleep, they were eroding Japan's strategic endurance. The destroyer fleet, once a symbol of Japanese naval precision, became a fleet of insomniacs, nervous, reactive, and drained. The irony was brutal. The very destroyers that had once escorted the mighty carriers of the empire were now hunted by boats made of wood and paint, commanded by men who refused to play by traditional rules. The Japanese tried to adapt. Some captains turned off lights completely and relied on sound navigation, others began deploying decoy barges or dropping small explosives into the water to deter PT approaches. There were even experiments with new radar systems and anti-PT patrols, involving smaller escort ships. Yet the damage to morale had already been done. The destroyers' reputation as unstoppable hunters was broken. Sailors whispered that the Americans had found a way to control the ocean's own darkness, to move through it as if unseen by gods or men. Officers scolded them for superstition, but the fear remained. For many Japanese crews, every ripple in the water became a threat. They began overreacting, opening fire on anything that moved, which sometimes included their own smaller craft. The once proud discipline of the Imperial Navy eroded under the strain of paranoia. It was as if the PT boats had infected the entire system, not through destruction alone, but through the weaponization of uncertainty. American naval historians later described this psychological warfare as one of the PT fleet's greatest contributions. It wasn't about tonnage sunk, but confidence stolen. The Japanese had built their empire on the belief that discipline and courage could overcome any obstacle. The PT boats proved otherwise. They showed that adaptability, creativity, and audacity could rewrite the rules of engagement. Each 40-knot strike was not just a physical blow but a philosophical one, a statement that the old world of formal combat was dead. By 1945, even as Japan's navy lay shattered, the destroyers that remained carried the scars of those night battles. Some had survived dozens of PT encounters, others bore the twisted metal reminders of near misses. But what truly lingered was memory, the faces of unseen enemies, the roar of engines in the dark, the impossible speed of death flashing across the sea. The Japanese Navy had once dreamed of decisive battles under the rising sun. Instead, it found itself defeated in the darkness by enemies it had never learned to respect. As victory banners rose over Allied bases across the Pacific, veterans on both sides reflected on those strange duels between giants and ghosts. American PT crews recalled moments of terror and triumph, of watching towering destroyers explode under the glow of moonlight. Japanese survivors spoke of the helplessness of firing blind into the night, of hearing engines approach and vanish like whispers from another world. In the end, it was not the number of ships sunk that defined this confrontation, but the transformation it represented. The war had shifted from an era of grand fleets and battleship duels to one of speed, innovation, and asymmetry. The PT boats, with their roaring engines and fragile hulls, had symbolized that change, proof that even the smallest craft could alter the fate of empires. And as the final days of the Pacific War faded into history, the question lingered among naval scholars and veterans alike: how could the mighty destroyers of Japan, armed with the world's best torpedoes, have been caught off guard by boats barely larger than a fishing vessel? The answer was both simple and tragic: they had never expected the impossible. But in war, the impossible was exactly what America had learned to deliver. As the war drew toward its violent climax, the saga of Japanese destroyers versus American PT boats had become a study in contrasts, not merely of machines, but of mentalities, of pride against pragmatism. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the Pacific War with unmatched confidence in its destroyer arm. These ships, embodiments of craftsmanship and precision, carried the soul of Japan's maritime power. Every rivet, every gun mount reflected a tradition that stretched back to the victories of the Russo-Japanese War. Destroyer crews were the elite, disciplined, ritualistic, guided by the code of Bushido even on the ocean waves. Against such pedigree, the Americans had unleashed something that should have been laughable: small wooden boats, built in haste, powered by gasoline engines, manned by sailors barely out of their teens. To the Japanese, this was not war, it was desperation. And yet, as the tide of battle turned against the rising sun, it was desperation that proved more adaptable than pride. The PT boats, streaking through the darkness at 40 knots, embodied everything Japan had failed to anticipate: the raw, unpolished ingenuity of a nation learning to win through innovation instead of ritual. By 1944, the destroyers that once prowled the Solomon Sea as confident predators were now moving with caution, their every maneuver shaped by the fear of unseen attackers. Convoy runs that should have taken hours stretched into days, as captains ordered zigzagging routes, halted for radar scans, or waited for air cover before proceeding. The once fluid coordination of Japanese night operations began to crumble. PT boats had turned the darkness, once Japan's greatest ally, into an enemy. Every sound became suspect: the echo of an engine, the slap of a wave, even the call of seabirds could trigger gunfire. Some Japanese officers confessed in diaries recovered after the war that their men had begun to imagine PT boats where none existed, firing at shadows until ammunition ran low. The exhaustion was overwhelming. It was not merely the physical toll of combat, but the mental corrosion of being hunted by something that should have been inferior. Pride had become a liability. The empire's greatest warriors were now haunted by the notion that courage alone was no longer enough. The Americans exploited this collapse with surgical precision. PT squadrons were no longer operating independently. By 1945, they were integrated into a larger Allied network of air reconnaissance, radar outposts, and submarine pickets. Together, these forces created killing grounds in narrow straits and coastal channels where Japanese supply ships and destroyers had no room to maneuver. The PT boats, armed now with better torpedoes and radar, became the first line of contact. They ambushed convoys, marked targets for aircraft, and guided submarines into position. The Japanese destroyers tried to fight back with heavier escorts and depth charges, but it was too late. Their logistics network was collapsing, their fuel reserves evaporating. Even if they wanted to chase the PT boats, they often couldn't afford the fuel to do it. What had begun as a tactical nuisance had evolved into a strategic nightmare, a death by 1,000 small strikes. Each encounter, each loss, eroded Japan's capacity to sustain the war. For every destroyer forced to retreat or damaged by a torpedo, an entire island garrison went hungry, another convoy failed to reach its destination, another hope of resistance flickered out. Yet even in defeat, the Japanese destroyer men fought with the fatalistic valor that defined their service. Many refused to retreat even when surrounded by PT boats and aircraft. There are accounts of destroyer captains ramming into PT flotillas, attempting to crush the small craft under their hulls, turning the sea into a boiling mass of splinters and fire. Some succeeded, destroying one or two boats before succumbing to torpedo hits themselves. To the Japanese, this was an honorable death; to the Americans, it was madness. The clash of these two mental worlds, one driven by discipline and duty, the other by improvisation and daring, symbolized the broader war between their nations. In the end, though, it was the American approach that proved superior. The PT crews were allowed to think, to adapt, to take risks that doctrine forbade. A Japanese destroyer captain who disobeyed orders faced disgrace; an American PT commander who broke formation and sank an enemy was celebrated. That difference in freedom, the latitude to innovate, was perhaps the greatest weapon the Americans possessed. By the war's final months, as the Japanese fleet disintegrated under relentless bombing and blockade, the destroyers that survived became ghosts themselves. Some were scuttled to prevent capture, others were left stranded in shallow harbors, their once proud decks now silent. PT boats, though small, had played their part in bringing the giant to its knees. Their legacy was not in tonnage destroyed but in fear created, a fear that stripped away the illusion of invulnerability that had cloaked the Imperial Navy. In post-war analyses, Japanese officers admitted that they had underestimated the psychological power of surprise and speed. They had assumed the Americans would fight by the same rules, engage with comparable forces, and honor the traditional forms of battle. Instead, they were met with a form of warfare that broke every assumption, a doctrine of chaos that used unpredictability as a weapon. And it worked. The PT boats had shown that war no longer belonged to the biggest guns or thickest armor. It belonged to whoever could think faster, move quicker, and adapt first. When peace finally returned, many veterans on both sides struggled to explain what they had witnessed. American PT sailors, once celebrated as heroes, returned home with stories that sounded unbelievable, of charging destroyers at point-blank range, of seeing towering ships explode under their torpedoes, of surviving only by seconds and instinct. Japanese survivors, meanwhile, spoke of endless nights of confusion and fear, of trying to fight an enemy they couldn't see or predict. Their recollections were haunted not by the thunder of battle but by the silence that followed each engagement, the eerie calm after a PT strike, when all that remained was smoke, fire, and disbelief. Naval historians would later argue that these encounters foreshadowed the future of warfare, where speed, stealth, and intelligence would outweigh brute strength. In the age of missiles and submarines, the lessons of the PT boats lived on. The Japanese destroyers had never expected the sea to betray them so completely, never imagined that the darkness they once ruled could become the stage for their undoing. The story of the PT boats and the destroyers endures because it is more than a tale of machines, it is a parable of perception. The Japanese believed they understood war, that its boundaries were fixed, its honor codified. The Americans understood that war, like the ocean itself, was fluid. The PT boats were born from that understanding, fragile, flawed, yet perfectly adapted to the moment. When they raced through the night at 40 knots, they weren't just defying the enemy, they were defying the entire philosophy of naval combat. And for the destroyers of Japan, that defiance was the ultimate shock. The empire that had once prided itself on foresight and precision had been blindsided by creativity. In the end, the destroyers' greatest weakness wasn't their inability to hit a target that moved too fast, it was their inability to imagine that such a target could exist at all. That blindness, more than any torpedo or shell, sealed their fate. As historians look back across the decades, they see in those moonlit chases and roaring engines the symbolic turning point of the Pacific War, when technology met imagination, and imagination won. The Japanese destroyers had sailed into battle believing themselves invincible. The American PT boats, armed with little more than courage and horsepower, proved otherwise. It is said that war teaches through pain. For the Japanese Navy, the lesson came in the form of a blur of motion, a flash of flame, and the echo of engines fading into darkness. And so, long after the last PT boat was decommissioned and the last destroyer lay rusting beneath the waves, their story endures, a reminder that in the theater of war, even the smallest spark of innovation can outshine an empire built on tradition.